Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. There's a strange psychological yin and yang where when there's darkness, the mind creates light to oppose it. And when there's light, shadows appear.
Darkness rises and light to meet it.
This is as true in ordinary human psychology, in all of us in other words, as it is in criminal psychology. The difference is things are a lot more twisted, deviant and extreme in criminal psychology. In this analysis, I want to break down the disproportionate role fantasy plays in the mind of a serial killer. We also want to touch on the elements of fantasy we know about in Rex Heuermann. Before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. If you're enjoying this episode, please like, share, leave a comment. You can also hit the thanks button. And let's get started. So let's do a brief recap of these instances where we can see that there's fantasy in the Long Island serial killer suspect. All of us have fantasy in our lives, some more than others. I think it's fair to say that serial killers have an unhealthy level of interest in their fantasy worlds, and also the particular brand of fantasy that catches their fancy, that piques their interest, is psychologically unhealthy too. And I think if there's a lesson in this, and I think there is, be careful of your own fantasies. Be mindful of the things that you dwell on when in your daydreams. Now, we get glimpses into Heuermann's psychological sickness when we look at his vile internet searches. How did it come to this? From a shy, passive mama's boy to an imperious, aggravating, anal, power-drunk hustler. From an awkward kid backstage behind the curtain at Alfred Berner High School Drama Club to the confidence trickster of Manhattan engaged in 4 lawsuits for a gross of $20 million in damages. No surprise that some reports use the word staged to describe some of these quote-unquote accidents. The 279 guns in Heuermann's cluttered home suggest some sort of battle was going on in his mind, inside his cluttered psychology. The guns, the great number, are also a sign and a symbol, not only of some ideas that are broken loose from rational moorings, but that they are supposed to do the thing that he is powerless to do: slay the anxiety dragon, give him some sense of control in a world that seems to be infested with monsters. There is also a fantasy element in architecture. Manhattan is proof of the fantasy pudding that lofty skyscraping dreams can be realized in gritty reality, that dreams can come true. And yet somehow when Heuermann trudged the streets of Midtown Manhattan, when he stomped across the road to his office, a Godzilla rose and lurched in step with him between those canyons and corridors of steel and concrete. What does this all mean? And that brings us to fantasy and criminal psychology. So what is fantasy as a mechanism? Why does it come about? Should we not have any fantasies at all? What is the psychology of it? Do you remember Stephen King in his book Christine? He wrote, "If being a kid is about learning how to live, then being a grown-up is about learning how to die." What happens, though, if you're a kid and you're supposed to be coming alive, and you're supposed to be learning about coming alive, and you're supposed to be feeling like a coming-of-age movie? What if instead of all that, your daily bread is social death? Instead of excitement, enjoyment, fun, coming alive, there's humiliation, bullying, criticism, clawing insignificance, shame, pain. What if as a young person you find you're not in a fairy tale? Your father dies at 12 years old. Your life is a struggle as it is, but then it becomes a pride-swallowing sea. What if as a young person your life isn't life, it's a living death? Now, quoting from an article, I'll put a link to it in the description, children who do not have the power to control the mistreatment they suffer sometimes create a new reality to which they can escape. This new reality becomes their fantasy, a fantasy that they have total control of, and it becomes part of their daily existence. in this fantasy world, the emotional development is guided and maintained. Now, I think the important part to emphasize there, it's kind of self-explanatory, is that they are experiencing mistreatment. Whatever you may think of it, whatever someone else may say of it, from their perspective, it feels like mistreatment, and it feels so terrible that they try to escape it. But there you have it in 2 words. Fantasy is all about 2 things: power and control. If reality makes you feel powerless, then you retreat into fantasy. If you have no control of the real world, well, you can find some in fantasy. You can find some agency in fantasy. And I think a lot of these superhero movies at the moment are all about an artificial grab for an artificial sense of the abundance of agency. And that, of course, is a fantasy as well. In any event, this whole idea of retreating into fantasy is something I can, as a writer and as a reader, I can relate. Going back to the article, quote, according to Garrison, the child becomes sociopathic. I prefer the term antisocial, because the normal development of the concepts of right and wrong and empathy towards others is retarded because the child's emotional and social development occurs within this self-centered fantasy. And if you think about gaming, you can see how that can happen as well, that your development all can occur within the fantasy of a game. A person can do no wrong in his own world, and the pain of others is of no consequence when the purpose of the fantasy world is merely to satisfy the needs of one person. Continuing with the article, boundaries between fantasy and reality are lost, and fantasies turn to dominance, control, sexual conquest, and violence, eventually leading to murder. And so this is the essential part, that you couldn't have the serial killing take place without the underlying fantasy. Get rid of the fantasy and you won't have these murders. Well, how do you get rid of the fantasy? Well, you get rid of the mistreatment. And so the other thing is losing that boundary between fantasy and reality. How does that happen? Well, spending less and less time in reality, spending more and more time in fantasy. And all of us are doing this to some extent. Are you in the real world, or are you spending too much time in social media, which is not necessarily the real world? Is your social media realistic? So do you see, fantasy can lead to this crucial first step in the process of a dissociative state. In the words of Stephen Gianangelo, allows the serial killer to leave the stream of consciousness for what is to him a better place. And so you can obviously, to untangle, to undo all of this psychological malaise, will create a better place for this person in the real world. And again, all of this is fair and well. Blame the serial killer for killing, and he should be blamed. Blame him for entertaining himself through his sordid fantasies, and he should be blamed. Except he finds these fantasies, these aggressive, sadistic fuels already out there in the real world. What drives someone out of their own world and into the world of make-believe? Well, not so much the sort of general hard realities of the world, but the hard realities of people. Somebody said hell is other people. That is true for some people. For some people, other people are arseholes, phonies, bullies, real people who make the lives of others a living hell. Why? Because they can. Because there's sadism in ordinary people, even our parents, even our siblings. Dualism is very real in the world and in us. You know, there's day and night, there's our public face, there's our private face. And we also often have 2 personas, passive and aggressive. Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, to some extent. Schizophrenia is one way of describing it. But we have to ask, when it comes to Mr. Hyde, what fuels him? Anger, yes, but also fantasies. Well, where does that anger come from? Well, according to one definition, Hyde represents the fleshy sexual aspect of a man, and certainly in the Victorian age, they felt the need to hide that. Hide the fleshy animal side to yourself. hide the vulnerable side to yourself, hide the spontaneous, natural side to yourself. As a child, you also get taught, if you have an accident, that must be hidden away, that must be flushed away. And there's some practical social reason for that, to preserve and to make sure that social intercourse is to some extent comfortable. But then you take it a little further and you look at what criminologist Jose Sanchez said. Quote, "The lack of empathy for their victims among young criminals is just one symptom of a problem that afflicts the whole society." Well, you don't need to go and see a criminologist to find symptoms of a lack of empathy. Just go to social media, turn on your television, turn on the news. According to the article, Lorenzo Carcatera, author of Gangster, it's a book that came out in 2001, he explains how potential criminals are labeled by society. Right? In other words, they are labeled in a certain way before they become criminals. He goes on to say the ability for serial killers to appreciate the mental life of others is severely compromised, presumably leading to their dehumanization of others. In other words, it's a situation where their own mental life is compromised, and so they are unable to imagine the mental lives of others. Also worth noting, before his execution, serial killer Ted Bundy said that pornography had stimulated and increased his need to commit homicide. Well, of course, it's not just pornography. It's a particular kind of fantasy pornography. And this is the answer. The very antithesis of death is sex. Sex is central to issues of identity, and if both the sexual aspect and issues of identity aren't resolved during adolescence, if a person, instead of spreading their wings and leaving the nest, is crushed into their eggshells, well, then those issues aren't resolved, and they are eventually going to be resolved one way or the other. And if one's life has been stolen from you, this is one way to get it back, to regain control through sex. And if the sexual urge can be weaponized in a fantasy sense, then there is a sort of conquest of death, social and otherwise, and the identity triumphant at last, by proxy, of course. And yet the real world continues to beat down, undermine, and humiliate this crushed-in individual, forcing his fantasies to compensate until they become so all-consuming they spill over into the real world. And what might trigger that? Well, it could be something like a divorce. What that is and what it feels like is self-actualization when it spills over into the real world. It feels good to be the perpetrator and not a spectator. But in the real world, we're dealing with a serial killer who has found his feet. As long as I've been writing books, I've warned against believing too deeply in fairy tales, because believing in fairy tales awakens nightmares. So be careful of what they are. Believing in fairy tales can only take place if there's a sort of denialism taking place in another part of ourselves. And that is another part of the story. That is another part of this dimension, denial. And so if you'd like me to talk about that, this area of denial in psychology, how that opens the door to fairy tales and fantasy, let me know in the comments. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.